experts to talk about the African response to the crisis in Ukraine. My name is Julian Piquet. I am the Washington correspondent for the Africa Report, part of the Jeune Afrique group. And today with me, I will be speaking with four incredible speakers. Vemba Dizolele, the Africa Program Director at CSIS. Dr. Joseph Sani, the Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace Africa Center. Mr. Ebenezer Obadare, Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Ambassador Ramayad, Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. So I'd like to open things up by talking a little bit about Africa Day. As you know, it was created to celebrate the foundation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. And I thought it would make sense to start today's conversation by looking at how its successor, the African Union, is responding to the crisis in Ukraine. I found it quite fascinating personally that President Macky Sall of Senegal denounced the Russian invasion in his role as chairman of the African Union back in late February. But then his country joined 16 other African countries in abstaining in a similar vote at the UN General Assembly. I was, wanting to talk to you all about what this says about the politics of the conflict in Africa. Why did the different countries vote the way they did? Why did we see this split on the African continent? And, what is the consequence of this African ambivalence on the geopolitical scene? Also, what do you think of how the African Union has handled things so far? And, with that, I'd love to open this up to, I don't know if one of you would like to start. If not, maybe Ambassador Yad, you can have the first word on this issue.
Thank you, Julian. Happy to join this very important conversation about the African answer to the crisis in Ukraine. It's pretty unusual to tackle the Ukraine crisis through the African perspective. So, and it's not normal because Africa has an important role in the new geopolitical order, and Africa can be a concern on the Ukraine issue on two fronts, and that's why the role of the African Union is so important. The first one is on the moral front. I mean, the fundamental question of values. Do you remember at the very beginning of this crisis, while Eastern Europe was asking for the support of the world, we saw African students at the frontier, at the Polish border, being mistreated just because of their color. It was not acceptable, of course, and that's why that was the first reaction of the African Union. This angry press release published by the current chair of the African Union, Macky Sall, to protest against this mistreatment against the African students. Beyond this moral aspect, there is a strategic concern in this relation between Africa and this crisis. Maybe there's a link between both of them, but this strategic aspect explained that nearly half of African states, including Senegal and Morocco, abstained at the UN, or they did not take part in the UN vote condemning the Russia invasion. More countries refused to accept or to vote for the sanctions, not only because of this mistreatment I was just mentioning, but because African countries have this desire to stand equidistant from Russia and the Western world, not to mention the economic consequences that could hit, and that already hit the African economies, already shaken by the impacts of the pandemic. And the last point is maybe in the past, Russia stood by Africans against apartheid and colonization in the name of the right of people to self-determination. There's a contradiction between that and what's going on with Ukraine sovereignty. But that's the way it is. And that's why this African point of view must be taken seriously. From New York, Paris, or Berlin, Russia seems isolated, but from the rest of the world, what people call now the global south, including Africa, not so much. And the abstention of China, Russia, India, and half of Africa is already half of the world's population.
If I may,
go ahead.
Yeah, if I may just quickly add to that, just to set the context for this, just to maybe point out two quick things. One is that beyond, what we're saying about Africa, that every major conflict in the international system always offers an opportunity for reset. So it's not unusual that in this very particular moment, African countries are bringing forward, a raft of grievances. Historically, this is what disprivileged and disfavored groups who feel that they don't have a buy-in in a particular order, this is what they've always done. I think it's important to just get that out there so that people have, a much more global context for what we're talking about. The second thing that is also oddly new, which pertains to Africa, is that many of the grievances that African countries, have articulated are also not particularly new. What appears to be new is that we're getting to hear them for the first time. So if you go back to, the 50s and 60s, the heyday of, African nationalism, read, Kenneth Kaunda, read Julius Nyerere, even read Mugabe, before, he got into trouble later on. I mean, we can, talk about that. But the point is that, read Senghor, right? The point is that none of what has actually come out over the last 3 or 4 months is new. What is new is that on the back of this conflict, African countries are being heard, they're getting the attention. And a third point, which I think is a corollary of that, is the reason why they seem to be getting all the attention. One, of course, is, is the moment. And when I talk about the moment, I'm talking about the intellectual ferment that antedated this particular crisis. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been following the political science and sociology literature very closely. African scholars have been talking about decolonization. So, and I say that without prejudice to the merits or demerits of the argument itself. But to the extent that it emphasizes the need to take African agency, African ideas, African history, African future seriously, it's very interesting that the Ukraine conflict has happened at the very moment, which is one of the reasons why African grievances, have caught fire and come to everybody's attention. So I just wanted to put those things out there, just to add to Ambassador Rama's, prefatory remarks. Thank you.
Dr. Sani, it was interesting to see that the African countries that are part of the Security Council during this current year, Kenya, Gabon, Ghana, they all came out in favor of this resolution. The countries that are not on the council, perhaps for domestic political purposes, took a different stance. I'm wondering if you see sort of a different, like a bifurcation almost of the desire to, when you're on the international scene for the African countries to really be seen as leaders on the rules-based international order, but then for political domestic purposes, maybe taking a different approach. And, I mentioned Macky Sall, who was, kind of took 2 different approaches as chairperson of the AU and then as president of Senegal. I was hoping you and Mr. Dizolele could talk to us a little bit about that, and that this is, that balancing act almost.
Yes, I thank you for the question, and I want to thank Ebenezer and Ambassador Yad for their remarks and the answers. I will just want to add that, let me start by saying that, yes, there are reasons for African countries to be suspicious. But let's go back to the statistics. 17 plus 8, 25 countries vote abstain or just ran away or voted for out of 54. So it's not like Africa abstained. Okay, so countries voted with the rest of the Western world. And I think personally, I think as much as we friends of Africanists are happy with African assertiveness and growing agency in the world scene, but that agency also comes with responsibility, and responsibility grounded on principles. Ambassador Yad mentioned there was a moral element to this. Yes, there was, because it was not a choice between Russia and the rest of the world, or Russia, or the choices between two Cold War powers. It was a choice between upholding or reaffirming core principles of the collective security, so sovereignty and territorial integrity. By the way, these principles are also foundational to the African Union. So it was a choice between supporting and affirming those principles and aggression. And so I think, personally, I think there was a moment we missed the African countries, some, not all, those who abstained or voted against, one country voted for, missed the opportunity to affirm core principles. With great responsibility with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that it was a missed opportunity. Now, we can discuss that later. We cannot summarize or reduce African geopolitical importance on that vote alone. There are many areas. Or it will also be a mistake for the United States or the Western power to reduce their relationship to that vote or the war in Ukraine. But I really want to say, yes, it was a missed opportunity. There are many grievances, rightly so, historical mistakes. Libya, where the NATO went to Libya without African consent. There are things like that, Côte d'Ivoire, etc. But I think this vote was a little bit a missed opportunity. You're on mute, Julian.
Sorry, I'll stay on mute. Yeah, Mr. Dizalele, if you have any follow-ups, and maybe talk a little bit about, which countries for domestic political purposes had to take the approach that they did. I mean, are we seeing, countries where there's more support for Russia having to take a particular stance? Is this have to do with local, electoral reasons as well?
Thank you very much, Julian. I would like to thank my colleagues who went before me. I think a few things that I would like to highlight. One is historical perspectives. I think we need to consider and realize that African countries are sovereign nations. They should not be taken for granted. My sense is like there's this perspective in the West where like, how dare they vote the way they voted? Well, they voted the way they voted because every country has its own interests. So even this entire debate about were there local interests or no local interests, of course they were local interests, because that's what politics is about. It's always about local interests. So when I say historical perspective, Africans were brought into World War I. They didn't vote on World War I. They were just forced into World War I. They went and liberated countries on behalf of Western nations, colonial nations. They were forced to be into World War II, even helped liberate Paris. Never got credit for it, by the way. No, very few books in the West teach about the contribution of Africans to all these wars. The way history is taught, you think only Europeans fought the war with the Japanese, and that was the end of it. Those debates are still ongoing in countries like Senegal, countries like DRC. What is the responsibility of those powers who forced the African into these wars today? Iraq was the same thing. Senegal joined the coalition of the willing. To what end? That can be debated. The Senegalese are better positioned to debate that. the Arab-Israeli war is one that Africans had to be forced to, in which they had to pick sides. I think Africans are tired of always being forced to pick sides on issues that are important to them, but that not always look to them the same way they look from Washington or from Paris elsewhere. So I think it's important to understand that Africans are tired of this way of, even the fact that we're having this discussion, it's an important discussion, but in my view, while it should be had, I'm not sure how important it is in the sense of course, India voted according to India's interests. Of course, South Africa will vote according to South African interests, including these historical perspectives. So that's the one thing that I want to put out there. But the other thing I want to put is like, there's also the issue now of exactly how do we in the West, I'm in the West, so I talk about the we since we're in the West, we're presenting Western institutions, that's where we're working. We need to change the mindset and the frame we approach Africa. In Africa, we should approach them as independent sovereign countries and not always come knocking on the doors when somehow we just need the vote. As far as the question of the, what seems to be like a kind of dichotomy between the way Macky Sall voted or spoken as chairman of the African Union and president of the country. As chairman of the African Union, of course, he's speaking about the consensus position of the organization. That, by the way, was very in line with the charter of the institution, just like Sani had said. As president of Senegal, he's talking as the president of Senegal, that we go all politics being local, however international the prism may be. So to me, I think this is actually an interpellation, a call, Sani referred to this again, where the West need to start rethinking their own position. This is not 1945, where you just order Senegalese tirailleurs to show up at the port and you're gonna ferry them to Paris. And it's also a big question. This is not, after the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we thought the world would be unipolar. The world is not unipolar. The world is multipolar. It's still reconfiguring itself. But you go to Djibouti, you find the Chinese, you find the American, you find the French, you find the Turks, you find the Gulf Arab states. So Africans have choices, and as they make decisions, they take into consideration all those options in front of them.
Before we talk about the impact of the Ukraine crisis on Africa, I want to talk to you, just follow up maybe with you, Mr. Dizolele, real quick, about this great responsibility versus the African agency issue. Since the late February, the United States government has gone out of its way to press the African countries to take its side, basically, against Russia. And part of that, of course, is that they don't want to be seen as being responsible for all the hardships that have come out of the conflict in terms of rising fuel prices, food, fertilizer, etc. How are you seeing the African response to these overtures from Western powers and the U.S. government in particular? I mean, is it seen as neo-colonialist meddling? Is it seen as a positive thing? What do you think of people like Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland sort of making the rounds and trying to really drum up support for the U.S. and Western position on this? Is it working, or does it risk having the opposite effect?
Any engagement with African from the U.S., I think it's welcome, in the sense that if they're making overture, we welcome overture, because that should not only happen in time of crisis because the U.S. needs vote. So it doesn't add a lot of value in that sense. Those overtures should have happened all the time for the last 25 years. They've not been happening. So again, it's not adding the value that it should have. It almost it almost comes across as fake because it's very transactional. It should not be transactional. And those overtures in many ways kind of confirms the sense of being taken for granted. It's like, okay, you didn't vote this. Can we dangle this to you? Will this work for you now? That if we do this, will this work? Well, that's not what the US does with France or with its other allies. They just know that we'll talk, we'll see how this will work. Well, how about having good African allies that you've been working with consistently throughout? So the question is not people wondering, why are we voting with the US? The question that is so obvious in the eyes of the population, like, of course, this makes sense because this is the way we've always worked. So it cannot be, it's kind of a drive-by diplomacy. And drive-by diplomacy is just that, it's drive-by diplomacy. And people will take it at its face value.
Right. I don't know if Ambassador Yad or Dr. Sani, Mr. Obadar, any?
Yeah. Let me take a riff on that because I perceive a slight tension between Uvemba and Sani, and maybe I'm leaning slightly towards Sani here. So let me take a stab at this. The first point I think I would like to sort of put forward, and I wouldn't want us to forget this, is that we shouldn't take it for granted that African leaders, not all of them, but that many of them are necessarily speaking on behalf of the people that they govern. The divide, profound divide between people and governments in Africa is extremely important, and I think is worth taking into consideration. And it raises, very serious, questions of governance. That if we are going to take African agencies seriously, as we indeed all are, then I think it's morally imperative, it's incumbent on us, that we talk about. So one of the leaders who has been most articulate, in basically, calling the Western bluff, and basically saying, Western countries should not, should basically get out of the business of African countries, is President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. We have to ask questions about what his intentions are and the extent to which we can perceive him to be a true representative of his people. I mean, the detail is out there, and I don't want to bore us with that, but I think it's a very important question that African leaders may want one thing, the people of Africa may want something totally different. And why do I say this? So think about when President Zelensky, basically said, look, we need your help. And we can talk about what African countries are doing in response to that. Young people in Africa, I remember in Nigeria, and I've written about this, came out in Abuja, the federal capital of Nigeria, and said they wanted to enlist because, and this is going to be my second point, they thought there were very fundamental universal issues at stake. And I think we should also talk about that. What is the substance of the issues at stake? My brother has spoken very eloquently about African grievance, that the rap sheet is extremely long. And for the most part, is totally justifiable and plausible. But it's also important to keep in mind that what exactly is at stake in Ukraine, the fact that one independent country has trampled upon the territory of another country, is something that should be uppermost on the minds of African countries, given their own history. So the substance of it's important we don't reduce this to Russia versus Ukraine, or the West, versus Russia, even though those elements are there. But the core of it, the substance of it, is extremely important. My final point regarding that is that, on the one hand, we're saying that African countries should be treated as, as the sovereign state that they are, that their agency should be respected. I think everybody around this table agrees with that. But there are also questions about whether they are economically dependent and whether they can actually run their affairs in such a way as to reduce their vulnerability to shocks in the international system. My brother mentioned something about, November said something about African countries not, being told about the First World War, Second World. That's true. But there are always two things you want to know about the war, and it pertains to this Ukraine conflict. You can go to a war, or whether or not you go to a war always comes to you. African countries live within a global system. whether you like it or not, you're going to have to take positions. It's extremely important, and this is what I think, Sandy was saying earlier, that this is a moment that offers, considerable opportunity for African countries to put their money where their mouths are and to say, now, we've talked about all these grievances of ours. We hope you listen to them, and we are going to continue droning on until you listen to them. But it's also important that at the end of the day, when the lines are drawn, it's important that African countries are seen to be backing, respect for the territory of other countries, issues of governance, and coming forward to make very concrete articulations about a new international, security, military, and political architecture that they want and they find desirable. There is no way they are going to do that if they were to go the way of Russia. Mm-hmm. So I can say more about this, but I don't want to hog the conversation.
Ambassador Yad, on this issue of the path forward now, as we know, Africa had nothing to do with this crisis, and yet it has suffered disproportionately from these disruptions we talked about: food supply, fuel, fertilizer, et cetera. The U.S. administration has sought to present itself as a responsive party to this. They've announced $2.6 billion in emergency food aid. Other Western powers have done the same. We've seen the UN take a role in this. Do you believe the international community is doing enough to help Africa cope with the ramifications of the war in Europe? And on the other side of that question, how do you see Africans responding to these rising prices? Who are they blaming? The Russians for invading, the Western powers for these sanctions? How do you think this is all playing out in terms of the impact of the war?
Yeah, this question is very important, critically important, because I think we can say it would be so easy if it was only one crisis here about prices, for example, but it's much more than that. The global economy, and including Africa, faces at least 4 major crises. That's why it's a turning point. It's a lot in terms of it's a historical situation here we have. The first major crisis is, like you said, the highest inflation in 40 years in the United States and Europe. We have like 7-8% of inflation. The war in Ukraine has led to rising costs for fuel, for food, for fertilizers in Africa, from Ghana to Nigeria, Egypt, etc. If we take the example of Ghana, the inflation has the country has seen inflation rise to more than 15%. Amid a hike in fuel prices and a near 16% of loss in the value of its currency against the dollar this year. So that's the first problem, the highest level of inflation in 40 years for everybody in the world, and especially for African countries, especially for dynamic economies like Ghana or Nigeria or Egypt. The second point, second crisis, very important, is the energy crisis, of course. The most serious in the world, oil, gas, coal, all the sectors are involved in this energy crisis. And the war in Ukraine is fueling tensions over the prices of agriculture raw materials. The third crisis, major crisis for the world, including Africa, is, of course, the food crisis. And we could spend hours to talk about the prices of wheat, tomatoes, bread, everywhere. And fourth crisis is the climate crisis. That should not be forgotten here, because, of course, it's still there. So 4 crises that will have to be faced in the same time by the whole world, and it can lead this world into a general recession. And don't forget that the world was facing already the consequences of the COVID-19. We should not forget here. So these simultaneous effects are at the origin of a major turning point, and that's where we stand right now. And Africans, I think for Africans, the question is not how can the rest of the world or Western countries help or support Africans to face this situation. You can see, and we experience that every day, that all the donations, the support, the humanitarian aid, etc., are now in Ukraine more and more. And the humanitarian organizations on the ground, they every day they draw our attention on this, saying, be careful, all the aid is going to Ukraine, and Africa is less and less involved in this strategy of emergency. So, and I think it's too late or unhelpful to focus on this kind of support. I think this historical crisis, with the 4 crises I just mentioned, it is a turning point to engage structural reforms. I mean, the reform of the international financial system, the reform of the international development architecture. I think it's the right time to ask, to raise that question. How can we reform the Bretton Woods system to include or tackle in a better way the climate crisis, the food crisis, the inflation crisis, all these problems. So it's the right moment to do that.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Sania, I see you nodding a lot here.
Yes, I think, yes, Julian, you have, I mean, your previous question is linked to this one too. And as Ambassador Yad mentioned, we are facing a confluence of transnational crises, right? And therefore, this is a moment of opportunity to rethink our global response to this crisis. And Africa is a key player, it's a major player in this dynamic, right? So when you mention the visits and the pressure or lack of pressure from the Biden administration, I say diplomatic overtures are always welcome. And I hope that the reaching out is part of looking, finding, bringing African into involving the mechanisms and decision makings to address this transnational crisis. We have many crises on our hand, and it's the time Africa needs more global economic engagement, and Americans and the West need more partners, not fewer partners. And considering that this is a moment of opportunity, and I've written about it, it's also a moment to redesign our multilateral system, because the bigger picture here is our rule-based system is under stress. It's being challenged, right? So maybe we say in French, it's soufflement. Maybe it's a moment of renewal. And that's why it's important to engage with the continent. And we welcome more of this kind of engagement from the US, from the West, looking at African countries, not just Africa as a concept, but African countries, sovereign countries, as key partners in resolving these multiple crises and bringing together the various tools at our disposals to do so. But my previous colleagues have said everything, yes.
I want to talk about African leadership on some of these issues, notably on food. You know, there's this, we see these market disruptions, and of course there's been calls to stop some of these food imports, really focus on local food production. You know, we've seen the head of the UN Economic Commission for Africa sort of put out this plan to pool resources to acquire fertilizers so that we don't suffer so much from these disruptions in the future. what are your thoughts on, especially given we see the African Continental Free Trade Area clumping together now. So what are your thoughts on Africa's ability to sort of take this crisis right now and these four crises that, Ambassador Yat talked about, and is there a silver lining there in terms of maybe creating this new intra-African partnership where they're not so much reliant on all these imports, notably of food, maybe move away from catch crops towards a more sustainable sort of agriculture. I wonder if, perhaps Mr. Obadari, you'd like to speak to that. Is this
Sure.
the moment for Africa to shine on this and change its approach?
Yeah, sure. I can maybe a couple of quick comments on that. One is that what you've just said, the economic crunch the African countries are experiencing, is actually a reminder to us that wherever you are in the international system, there is no hiding place, that you are part of a global order. Whether or not you are taking part directly in a war, you are bound to suffer the consequences of that war. I think this economic crunch is a very important reminder of that fact. So that's number one. But the second point is, and I think I can see that sentiment being expressed, around the table, and I want to align myself with that this has to be a moment of opportunity, for African countries. 60% of arable land in the entire world is in Africa. There's no reason African countries have no excuse to be in this situation. Now, they are right now, but I think this has to be a wake-up call where we say, okay, look, what is it that we need to do in order to make sure that the kind of crisis we find ourselves, that does not repeat itself? And I think part of the long-term answer is where, in thinking about, Ambassador Yat's, a newly reimagined world order, epistemologically, politically, economically, structurally, the international law, and all of that. We also consciously tied that to internal questions of internal governance in Africa. African countries cannot, on the one hand, ask for more just, more equitable, more democratic international system without doing the same thing at home. He who comes to equity must come with clean hands. So the opportunity comes in both directions. An opportunity for African countries to ask very pertinent questions, to raise questions of historical injustice, and to demand a reform of the international system. But at the same time, committing to full democratic reorganization of their own countries. Why is this important? This will be my final thing. It's important because one of the things that has been going on over the last 25 years, and you can see the evidence of that around this table, is that Africa has been hemorrhaging talent. The best engineers are leaving, the best medical doctors are leaving, the best social scientists are leaving, the best historians are leaving. Africa needs to be able to keep its own human capital. A more enriched Africa, agriculturally, economically, in terms of human capital, is a richer world. So these things are not mutually exclusive. African countries can, should, and ought to ask very critical questions about the structure of the international system. But at the same time, they have to then be able to commit to a more robust public sphere, and more autonomous civil society, and greater, commitment to democracy, within their own territories.
Just one point, Ebenezer's remarks on democracy in Africa made me remind that I forgot a fifth crisis, the democratic crisis in the world, and especially in Africa too. That concept of democracy may be the worst crisis among all the crises I was talking about. It's because it seems that the word democracy is not a shared value now. We thought that it was the last frontier. We thought that it was the end of history. But obviously, democracy, democratic values don't seem to be shared not only by states, but by the people too, including in traditionally democratic countries. Look, the United States, the democratic space is questioned. Look, European countries, more and more these illiberal democracy, what people call the illiberal democracies, are growing in not only in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe. So many people question democracy as helpful or a useful or a productive or a fruitful tool to solve the problems. There is a authoritarian desire today that is expressed through a few countries like even India, the first democracy in the world, Turkey. And we have all these leaders who have been elected in a democratic way, but who run their countries in an authoritarian way. And in this landscape, how can you handle the democratic challenge on the African continent? On one hand, you have, like Ebenezer said, this strong willingness of African civil societies to promote democratic values. They have now their own voice. They want to express themselves on social media and everywhere, and it's a good thing. But in the meantime, the concept of democracy seen as a Western value is more and more questioned by these young generations too. So there is a crisis there, very important. This word concept of democracy as concept and as practice is in a deep crisis that should call, I think that should call, to rethink something there too.
Right. And I think the responsiveness to, these issues is what's going to get, young people to favor or not favor democracy, right? So Ms. Mbemba, I'd like to follow up with you on that. The U.S. and its competition with China has made supply chains a vital, part of what it's looking at here, trying to get talent back to the United States, get production of things like, microchips back to the United States. Are we seeing any African countries lead on the response to the Ukraine crisis in terms of these supply chains, in terms of food production? Who are the leaders that are looking at this and saying, all right, this is our moment to change the architecture of food production, of different things like that? Are there any leaders on the continent that you can point to that are really taking this moment in stride and saying, all right, here's what we need to do, and sort of starting to make these changes that people are wanting to see?
Thank you, Julian. I think both Ebenezer and Ambassador Yad highlighted the challenges, the structural and leadership challenges of Africa. Africa has had several crises that call for rethinking of governance. But African countries have not been able to come one internally to bridge the gap between the aspirations of the people and the opportunity that arise. So that has not happened. This is the point I think Ebenezer was making early on about who do the leaders represent. They represent themselves for most of the time. They're not representing people. That part of the crisis of these illiberal democracies, people don't feel like the social contract is being upheld. The result of that is actually the key to your question. Well, who's going to lead? Well, very few countries, while they have the arable lands from Zimbabwe to DRC to Nigeria and so on, well, they don't seem to have the structural capacity. By that I mean taking advantage of the crisis. This isn't the first time the crisis is happening. Mm-hmm. Droughts, all kinds of crises happen all the time across the continent. The AU doesn't seem to be equipped for that because the AU is staffed by the same leaders that we have discussed. So I unfortunately don't see it as an opportunity that will be seized by these countries because they're just not positioned to do it. It's very clear in everybody's mind, this is an opportunity. If you eat a lot of wheat and you're Nigerian, you're Congolese, do you really need to eat wheat? Why don't you eat maize for your breakfast? Why don't you eat sorghum? But then you have to have a Ministry of Agriculture and the presidency that is invested in this kind of things, this kind of thinking. You need to have a Ministry of Public Works and Infrastructure that is invested in this kind of thinking. They will build the roads so your product can get to the market, people can buy them. So that is actually missing. So while it's a great opportunity, we've been having these opportunities for several years now, and everybody knows them. Scholars, experts, academics are writing about this. Civil societies are blowing the whistle on these issues. They're not happening. So unfortunately, I do not think this crisis, by that I mean the war between Russia and Ukraine, will all of a sudden light the bulb and everybody say, now let's march. No, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, I see it as another lost opportunities because the other structures are not in place.
Dr. Sani wants to weigh in, so I'll do a follow-up question to tie it back to another thing. You know, we've seen the director of the free trade area come to Washington multiple times to promote, you know, the African intra-regional trade. But are we seeing any actual impacts of that? Is it working? Is it happening? Or like, you know, Mvemba just said, is there a lack of leadership at the national level that makes it that, you know, the AFCFTA isn't going to have the impact that it otherwise could? I was wondering if Dr. Sani, you could weigh in on that a little bit.
The reason why I think it's difficult to point to a leader is because we keep looking at the government. I think we are missing the point, the private sector. I think we have not talked too much about the private sector yet. And I think this is also maybe a missed opportunity. It's my opportunity here to call for like the US government or the Western to say, you may not need to focus on the government alone. You can use the private sector on the continent. You can use the entrepreneurs of the continent, engage with them through the mechanisms and instruments we have, Prosper Africa, GFIC, and things like that, to see how we can seize those opportunities. We can engage with the civil society to help them work hard to increase the shrinking civic space. We don't generally have to go to some government. Of course, it will be helpful if we have the acquiescence of the government, but we need to be agile, creative in this particular moment to seize crisis. As Hanshan was saying, the consciousness that creates the problem is not the same consciousness that will resolve it. We need to be much more creative. And we, the West or the United States, we do have some tools to really work with our diplomats, work with other people to actually use those tools and engage with new stakeholders. Of course, there is no shortcut to good governance. I mean, I'm not naive here, right? It will make things easier. But I think it's also a moment of opportunity to bring in new stakeholders, the private sector, civil society, youth movements. We need to be creative at this particular moment. Because guess what? Just like Ambassador Yad said and Ebenezer, there are autocratic forces domestically, but there are also democratic forces domestically. So in the same country, you have people fighting tooth and nail to open the civic space, to liberalize the economy. You also have people fighting tooth and nail. Unfortunately, they seem to be winning to close the space. We need to pick our allies in those countries and work with them.
We're coming towards the end of our discussion, and there's one thing I really, really wanted to talk about. And Ambassador Yad, you mentioned the crisis of the environment and, you know, global warming. As in Europe, as in the United States, the war in Ukraine has also sort of transformed the discussion around energy versus environment in Africa. As you know, coal was being sort of removed from the continent before the war. Now Botswana, for example, says it's being inundated by European countries that want its coal. I think the president said that European countries are ready to buy 1 million tons of this stuff per year. Do you see the conflict breathing new life into the fossil fuel industry in Africa? And how is that going to impact the discussion around climate change? Because of course, at the same time, Africa is, the continent that is suffering the worst from the impacts of climate change. Looking forward to COP27 later this year in Egypt. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on whether Africa can meet its energy needs and take advantage of these new potential European export market while also leading in the fight to mitigate the impacts of climate change. How is the discussion changing in the wake of the Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, very important question. Let's pay attention to the big picture, because our conversation may give the impression that we are a bit pessimistic about the African future. We can be pessimistic about the world, but Africa may be the continent where the situation can be considered as, better in terms of dynamic. And I will then come to your question. Let's recall a few items. Africa is the home of 2/2 of the world's most dynamic economies. That's the reality. This is on the continent. You have a middle class beyond 1 billion in 2060. It's a lot. You were mentioning the world's largest free trade area. It is a new area. It is a hub of another multilateralism, an alternative multilateralism driven by global and regional powers. A lot is going on there. Someone, I think it was Dr. Sani, mentioned Somalia, where everybody is. It is a strategic continent, the oldest continent, the youngest population, and soon the largest population. It's the home of the biggest digital revolution in the world in these last 2 decades. It is a strategic area a strategic area that can feed the population. I think it was Ebenezer who was mentioning that 60% of the world's untapped arable land, the DRC, can feed the planet. And some resources are only found on the African continent. The hub of green technologies is Africa. So, of course, we have these threats like poverty, terrorism from the Red Sea to the Atlantic, and of course, climate change. But even there, the energy crisis can be an opportunity for Africa too. Africa is hit by this energy crisis right now, but it can be a powerful, sustainable alternative to Russian gas. The discoveries in Senegal, in Mozambique, the opportunities in Algeria, in Egypt, there are a lot of opportunities in terms of energy on the African continent. A new energy policy could be the first project of this renewed union in Africa. So that's something that could require the world's mobilization for alternative gas to Russian gas, but also more than that, a powerful answer to the climate change issues.
I don't know who wants to follow up on that, this idea that, so is it an answer to climate change, or are we risking seeing climate change become less of a priority for some of these countries as the energy crisis gets worse?
May I actually? Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. This one, actually, I'm pretty bullish on. I think the Africans have seized on this one. We've seen this at various COPs. Africa sees itself as a solution continent, as especially the Francophones say, we are le pays solution, ou le continent solution. So they've been really engaged on this space. And I think they've been very vocal, especially on the climate change space. The effects are obviously very clear. Sometimes they don't prefer the term climate change, they prefer the term environment because that is much easier to explain to you people in the streets than climate change, and the effects are very palpable. So there's that presents another opportunity for the West here to engage even full throttle with African continent. But the mindset, I think, on the Africa continent, it's very ripe for this engagement. As far as the oil, the energy, it's also similar. Now, can African country produce enough of oil and gas to meet everybody's demand? That's a different challenge. We're talking about a handful of countries, really. Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, Mozambique is coming off the ramp, and all that. But we have more countries that have the resources, at least the reserves, which remain at this point untapped. And the prospection and the exploitation take a long time. But overall, I will agree with my colleagues that this is actually a very ripe space, and Africans are well positioned to engage.
Great. We just have very little time here. Maybe Ebenezer, if you have any closing thoughts, I'd love to hear from you.
Nothing grand, but just to tie all this together, the political dimension. Nothing can be done without sorting out the politics. I think Kwame Nkrumah needs to be wheeled out again. He said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and everything else shall be added to you." Whether it's climate change, economic reforms, migration, terrorism, all those things. Once you get the political, question right, I think every other thing tends to follow. Basic questions about rule of law, social justice, and all of that. Once those things are in place, African countries, will be able to attract investment, and they'll be able to, head in the right direction. And just sort of to close the circle, it then becomes incumbent on us, I think, the question of intellectual leadership. And I'm trying to connect that to what Ambassador Yade said earlier about the crisis of liberal democracy. It's true that we live in a profoundly, a liberal moment. But for me, the answer to democratic erosion is democratic deepening. If there's anything that I think is universal, it's liberal values. Liberal values are not Western values. They are not African values. They are grounded in what we are, who we are as human beings. And I think that what African intellectuals, whether in Africa or in the diaspora, ought to do is to be able to take the lead as prophets and champions of those values. African countries need those values, and they need them right now.
Well, thank you so much for participating today. And of course, thank you for the Atlantic Council Africa Center for hosting this wonderful discussion. And we are out of time. So looking forward to speak to all of you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, friends. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay.